The European Union and the United States, two of the most deeply intertwined economic powerhouses in the modern world, now stand on the edge of a dangerous escalation. At stake is not merely a trade deal, but the stability of a transatlantic relationship that has long underpinned the global economy. Since April, the Trump administration has placed the EU under a 90-day reprieve, holding off on sweeping tariffs that could redefine the cost structure of European exports to the American market. That pause expires on July 9. If no deal is reached by then, virtually all EU goods entering the US could be hit with tariffs as high as 50%. This isn't a theoretical threat, it's a direct disruption to a trade corridor that moves nearly $1.7 trillion, or about $2 trillion, in goods and services annually. That's over 4.6 billion euros every single day. From pharmaceuticals produced in Belgium to German cars, Italian textiles, French wines, Irish tech services, tens of thousands of companies across Europe rely on relatively frictionless access to the US market. And the American economy, for its part, is heavily integrated with European capital, components, and consumer demand. But the negotiating table has grown cold. President Trump, emboldened by a protectionist mandate and seeking leverage before midterm elections, is prepared to rewrite the rules. He's signaling a pivot away from multilateral trade norms toward a transactional model. High-stakes, country-by-country deals designed to rebalance trade deficits through punitive measures. The EU, still publicly committed to WTO principles and multilateralism, now finds itself navigating a high-speed standoff that could either produce a skeletal compromise or a full-blown tariff war, one that reverberates through global supply chains, consumer markets, and boardrooms from Berlin to Boston. In 2024, the transatlantic economic relationship between the European Union and the United States remained the single most valuable trade corridor on Earth. According to data from Eurostat and the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the total value of goods and services exchanged between the two markets reached approximately $1.68 trillion, or just under $2 trillion. That breaks down to a staggering daily average of 4.6 billion euros crossing the Atlantic in both directions. This immense flow of commerce is not just a reflection of shared prosperity. It is the circulatory system of the global economy, underpinning millions of jobs, entire industrial supply chains, and transnational investment regimes. Beneath the surface of this enormous figure, however, lies a set of imbalances and sensitivities that now sit at the heart of the trade dispute. The European Union exported nearly 198 billion more in goods to the United States than it imported. That trade surplus has long been a point of contention in Washington, with President Trump repeatedly citing it as evidence of what he calls unfair European trade practices. Yet this figure tells only part of the story. In services, everything from cloud computing and engineering to finance, law, and logistics, American firms outperform their European counterparts, running a 148 billion surplus of their own. When the two are netted, the actual US-EU trade imbalance narrows to around 50 billion euros, less than 3% of the total trade volume. Statistically, this is minor. Politically, it has become combustible. And what exactly is being traded? On the European side, the export profile skews heavily toward high-value, precision-manufactured and regulated goods. Pharmaceuticals, primarily produced in Germany, Belgium, and Ireland, lead the charge. In 2023, the EU shipped over 92 billion euros in pharmaceutical goods to the US, medications that are often integral to American hospitals, insurance formularies, and life science R&D. Automobiles are another pillar. Brands like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz exported more than 750,000 vehicles to the US last year alone, valued at nearly 38 billion euros. Add to that aircraft components, particularly from Airbus, and luxury consumer goods from Italian leather and Spanish olive oil to French wines, and the picture is clear. Europe's exports reflect not only industrial capability, but also cultural and lifestyle influence. On the American side, the export portfolio reflects a different structure. The U.S. is the EU's largest supplier of crude oil and refined petroleum products, following the post-Ukraine energy diversification push. U.S. pharmaceutical firms, led by giants like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, also account for a substantial share of transatlantic medical trade. Boeing aircraft sales, though diminished in volume post-737 MAX and pandemic-era disruptions, remain a critical component. Equally important are technology-driven service exports, software platforms, financial products, cybersecurity systems, and legal services, all of which dominate the U.S. current account in Europe. This commercial interdependence is deep and durable, but not immune to disruption. The EU relies on the US for energy stability, key digital services, and components for aircraft and biotech sectors. The US, in turn, is deeply tied to European pharmaceuticals, automotive parts, chemicals, and even agri-food products such as specialty dairy, wine, and spirits. Disruption anywhere in this system, whether through tariffs, regulatory divergence, or investment controls, does not simply inflict bilateral damage. It reshapes cost structures, disincentivizes long-term contracts, and compels industries to reroute global supply chains, often at great expense. This is why the current standoff over tariffs is more than a political skirmish. It's a stress test for a multi-trillion-euro ecosystem of trade and production. The numbers suggest resilience, but the structural dependencies between American demand and European production, and vice versa, mean even modest changes in tariff regimes can cascade through sectors with force. The EU's pharmaceutical dominance, for example, is tied to FDA regulatory alignment and just-in-time logistics networks that depend on unimpeded customs clearance. The automotive sector, with integrated value chains stretching from Stuttgart to South Carolina, is vulnerable to even minor shifts in tax classification or border inspection delays. In the realm of services, uncertainty alone can freeze digital investment flows and cloud hosting contracts, particularly as both regions debate new regulations over AI, data sovereignty, and cross-border taxation. And yet, even as the data points to codependence, the political messaging diverges. The Trump administration views these imbalances as leverage. Brussels views them as interlocking systems that ought to be managed collaboratively. This asymmetry in perception may prove more destabilizing than any single tariff figure. Because once markets begin to price in unpredictability, not just higher costs, but structural policy volatility, the transatlantic corridor risks losing not just value, but trust. And trust, unlike GDP or customs revenues, takes years to build and seconds to destroy. The Trump administration has constructed a tariff strategy that breaks sharply from the multilateral rules-based order that governed transatlantic commerce for decades. Instead of treating trading partners under the most favored nation principle as mandated by the World Trade Organization, this administration is operating through a bespoke, tiered system of economic pressure. Within the White House and among senior trade officials, this is now colloquially referred to as the Rule of Three, a hierarchy of treatment that reflects both the status of negotiations and the political leverage the U.S. believes it holds over each trading partner. At the base level, countries that are seen as cooperating, those engaged in ongoing talks and willing to accept certain baseline conditions, are offered what Trump officials term a universal tariff rate of 10%. This is not a preferential rate in the traditional sense, but rather a new default. Even long-standing allies such as the European Union fall under this category, which would have been unthinkable under prior administrations. The 10% is not derived from any WTO framework, nor is it negotiated multilaterally. It is a unilateral figure imposed at the discretion of the executive branch. The second tier of this architecture applies to countries where talks have stalled or where disagreements remain unresolved. In this category, Trump has reinstated higher sector-specific tariffs that had been previously rolled back or suspended. For the European Union, this has meant the reintroduction of 25% tariffs on automobiles and automotive parts, a direct threat to Germany's manufacturing engine and the tens of billions in exports from plants in Stuttgart, Wolfsburg, and Munich. In this same bracket are the 50% tariffs on European steel and aluminum, which are particularly punitive for downstream industries in both Europe and the US that rely on integrated transatlantic material sourcing. The third tier is the most severe, punitive tariffs of up to 50% or more on nearly all goods exported by countries deemed uncooperative or adversarial in trade talks. These are not idle threats. European officials have confirmed that the Trump administration has issued warnings that, should negotiations fail by July 9, a 50% blanket tariff could be imposed across the full spectrum of EU exports. This would include industrial machinery, precision instruments, electronics, chemicals, and most controversially, pharmaceuticals. A move of this magnitude would rupture not just trade flows, but also contract law, investor confidence, and multinational production scheduling across both continents. The aggression has not stopped at industrial goods. In a development that many EU diplomats interpreted as a pressure tactic with domestic political undertones, the US has floated the imposition of a 17% tariff specifically on food and agricultural exports from Europe. The products targeted include some of the most culturally and economically significant items in Europe's export portfolio: Italian olive oil, Irish dairy, Belgian chocolate, Spanish cured meats, and French wines. These are not just commodities, they are high-margin goods central to national brands and regional identities. Collectively, EU agri-food exports to the United States exceed 35 billion euros annually. A 17% tariff would push many of these products out of reach for the average American consumer, triggering a substitution effect in US markets while devastating export revenue for small and mid-sized European producers. Such measures would ripple outward across logistics, packaging, labeling, and retail networks that have been calibrated over decades for open market access. Beyond the first-order economic damage, there is a second-order strategic intent. These tariffs would disproportionately affect the economies of countries like Ireland, Italy, France, and Spain, member states whose political leadership have voiced skepticism toward a quick deal with Washington. The geographic and sectoral precision of the food tariff threat appears to be engineered to fracture the EU's negotiating unity, pitting export-heavy nations against those advocating for a more hardline stance. In adopting this tariff framework, the Trump administration is not merely altering trade terms, it is redefining the very nature of global economic diplomacy. Tariffs, once instruments of last resort, have now become the opening salvo. Provisional deals are no longer seen as on-ramps to larger frameworks, but as ends in themselves, designed to extract concessions in the short term without committing to long-term mutual benefits. The outcome is an unstable equilibrium, where trade flows remain subject to presidential discretion, and where the specter of escalation is never far from the negotiating table. For businesses operating across the Atlantic, that means pricing volatility, contract uncertainty, and a growing reluctance to make capital investments that depend on predictable trade conditions. And for policymakers, it signals the erosion of the institutional guardrails that once kept economic disputes within a rules-based system. Europe's auto industry stands at the epicenter of the current trade standoff, both in terms of exposure and strategic importance. In 2023 alone, Germany exported approximately 750,000 vehicles to the United States, generating nearly 38 billion euros in revenue. These exports are not low-end mass-market cars. They represent some of Europe's most advanced automotive engineering, including electric vehicles, hybrid systems, and precision components. Manufacturers like Volkswagen, BMW, and Daimler operate extensive production and research facilities in the U.S., in states like South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee, supporting more than 100,000 American jobs directly and many more indirectly through their supply chains. Yet, despite this deep integration, these companies remain highly vulnerable to the Trump administration's 25% vehicle tariff, which would not only raise sticker prices for American consumers, but also destabilize internal cost structures across their transatlantic operations. In the pharmaceutical sector, the stakes are no less serious. The U.S. imported over 92 billion euros worth of pharmaceuticals from the EU in 2023, with much of that originating in Ireland, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. These products include everything from specialized cancer treatments to essential generics used in hospitals nationwide. The supply chains supporting this flow are not only capital-intensive but also tightly regulated. Any disruption, whether through increased customs friction or cost inflation from tariffs, could trigger knock-on effects across insurance pricing, hospital procurement schedules, and drug availability. With many of these compounds produced under long-term FDA-compliant contracts, even a modest trade barrier could introduce delays, recertification requirements, and price volatility, but the U.S. health system is ill-prepared to absorb. In aerospace, the level of integration is even more granular. Airbus, headquartered in Toulouse, France, maintains a final assembly line in Mobile, Alabama, where U.S.-made components, from avionics to composites, are integrated into European-designed airframes. This transatlantic manufacturing loop supports hundreds of small and medium-sized American aerospace suppliers, many of which depend on stable volume orders to remain viable. A tariff regime fluctuating between 10 and 50% would not only raise the cost of aircraft components and final products, but could also destabilize contract timelines and investment planning across the entire civil aviation ecosystem. The impact would be felt from suppliers in Wichita and Charlotte to final deliveries in Toulouse and Hamburg. The economic consequences of this standoff will not remain confined to customs offices or diplomatic cables. They will ripple through nearly every layer of the global economy. When tariffs are imposed on foundational materials like steel and aluminum, the effects cascade downstream. In the U.S., industries that rely heavily on these inputs, such as construction, automotive manufacturing, and home appliances, are already preparing for cost increases estimated between 15 to 30%. These are not theoretical figures. They come directly from procurement officers and trade association warnings, which point to rising bids, delayed project starts, and tighter margins. For everyday consumers, the impact will become tangible in higher prices across a wide array of goods. Inflationary pressure will be particularly acute in categories like electronics, alcohol, food products, and mid-tier consumer goods, sectors where European imports play a significant role. Retailers, working with tight supply chains, will have limited flexibility to absorb additional costs, meaning the end price is likely to be passed directly to American households. With core inflation already tracking above target, any added pressure from tariffs risks pushing prices even higher, particularly in lower income brackets where spending is most sensitive to food and essentials. The financial markets have already begun to register these signals. Following the initial April announcement of tariff hikes, yields on 10-year U.S. Treasury notes rose by 18 basis points, a clear indication that investors expect higher inflation and potentially tighter monetary conditions. That movement, while modest on its face, reflects shifting expectations about the cost of capital and the long-term trajectory of U.S. economic stability. At the same time, currency markets responded with volatility. The euro dropped 1.4% against the dollar in early July as traders factored in the possibility of retaliatory EU measures and the broader risk to European export competitiveness. Brussels, for its part, is not remaining passive. In the event of a full-scale tariff escalation, the European Commission has prepared a $100 billion list of retaliatory tariffs. These measures are targeted and deliberate, aimed squarely at politically sensitive U.S. exports, such as soybeans from Louisiana, bourbon from Kentucky, and aircraft components manufactured in Washington state. It is a strategic gambit, not just to match the dollar value of lost trade, but to exert pressure on congressional districts that may ultimately influence the White House's posture. What we are witnessing is not merely a trade dispute, but a recalibration of leverage between two economic superpowers, each testing how far the other will bend before the costs become unsustainable. Within the European Union, the internal calculus is far from unified. Germany, led by Chancellor Friedrich Merz, continues to push for a swift agreement, driven by the need to protect its vast industrial export sector, particularly automotive and engineering. For Berlin, the priority is clarity and continuity, even if that means accepting a 10% tariff as a baseline. In contrast, countries like France, Spain, and Denmark remain skeptical of conceding too quickly. Their argument is centered on precedent. Accepting a 10% default rate, they argue, would effectively normalize unilateral tariff setting and undermine the EU's long-standing commitment to WTO rules and multilateral negotiation. France's industry minister Marc Ferracci has been particularly vocal, warning that a flat 10% tariff, especially if applied to high-tech sectors like semiconductors or aviation, would do disproportionate harm to European value chains, many of which rely on seamless transatlantic flow and razor-thin margins. For France, the risk isn't just economic, but structural. Allowing sectoral vulnerabilities to be exposed now could invite future concessions in even more strategic domains. Meanwhile, on the American side, there is no indication that the Trump administration is interested in returning to WTO discipline. Instead, the United States is pressing ahead with a transactional, country-by-country tariff regime, effectively replacing multilateralism with economic coercion. More than 60 nations, including close allies, have received take-it-or-leave-it offers to accept customized tariff frameworks before the July 9 deadline. These offers are structured not as treaties or negotiated agreements, but as unilateral terms, with higher tariffs looming as the penalty for delay or defiance. The U.S. is no longer hiding its intent to use market access as leverage, reshaping global trade relationships in real time under a logic of conditional reciprocity rather than uniform standards. As this deadline approaches, the EU faces not just an external challenge, but a test of internal cohesion. Member states must decide whether to accept asymmetry now in hopes of revisiting terms later, or to risk escalation in order to defend long-term trade norms and systemic integrity. And now, with the July 9 deadline imminent, both sides are nearing the limits of negotiation. The stakes are enormous, not just for exporters and importers, but for the entire architecture of global trade. What began as a targeted dispute over tariffs is fast becoming a contest of values, between rule-based cooperation and transactional brinksmanship. The decisions made in the coming days will echo far beyond Brussels and Washington. They will define how economic power is wielded in the 21st century and who gets to write the rules.